Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second edition of Voices of Veterans, put on by myself, Dave Yano, a combat medic of Vietnam, and Steve Fournier, an Air Force veteran of the Vietnam era, and with the help and promotion of Hartford Public Access Television. We hope to continue to bring you programming that is specifically dedicated to the voices of veterans. Today, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the history of resistance among veterans in the United States Army during the Vietnam War. All throughout the war in Vietnam, as we all grew up during that time, we watched the peace movement grow and get stronger and more active in the streets in Washington, D.C. and all across the country. But what is not taught and what is not actually remembered is the resistance by the Vietnam veterans themselves and the other veterans who were starting to be conflicted about the war and were thinking about what they were actually doing in Vietnam. When I came home from Vietnam in 1971, there was a group of Vietnam veterans called Vietnam Veterans Against the War who had organized themselves to bring out the truth about what was happening on the ground in Vietnam. So what they decided to do was a lot of combat veterans got together and they, using history as one of their benchmarks, established the Winter Soldier discussions with Congress. And they called it the Winter Soldiers because it's based on the American history. In 1777, George Washington was leading the last ragged remnants of the Continental Army in Valley Forge, and many soldiers were drifting away and leaving from their posts because they were starving, they were ill, and they didn't understand what they were about to get into. So Thomas Paine wrote in his pamphlet, The Crisis, he said, "These are times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands it now deserves the thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. Yes, yet we have the consolation with us that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph." And these words were spoken as a way to talk about the Winter Soldier concept. This book that I'm reading from is called Winter Soldiers: The Oral History of Vietnam Veterans Against the War. And it's an attempt to provide a heretofore neglected perspective on another crisis, the Vietnam War, and on the debate that erupted during the war and that still persists among academics and politicians and in the popular culture today. A former Marine who served 3 tours in Vietnam between 1965 and 1968, John Kniffen, wrote, "We had taken an oath to defend the government of the United States and the Constitution. What do you do when the government of the United States is the enemy of the Constitution? Where does your allegiance lie?" Kniffen and many other veterans were motivated to speak and act against the war by an unshaken faith in the American people and in what they saw as an American ideals. Part of the reason that veterans are so conflicted about the war is that we're one of the first groups of veterans who went off to fight a war and discovered that the reasons we had gone to war were not the reasons we were actually there. The term Winter Soldiers was created by VVAW members who first adopted the name in 1971 during hearings held to investigate possible war crimes committed by American troops and their allies. The Vietnam Veterans Against the War claimed that such abuses were not aberrations, but were part of the standard operating procedure in Vietnam. They had created the term by inverting Thomas Paine's well-known words about summer soldiers. The summer soldiers and the sunshine patriots will in crisis shrink from the service of their country. Paine had been writing to encourage Americans, a ragtag army of citizen soldiers, to confront the most powerful military force in the world in order to protect their newly won independence and their democratic ideals. And the anti-war veterans saw an analogy with their own situation. We had gone to Vietnam, a number of us, for a number of reasons, believing what we were told by our fathers and our government. We were talked to about the domino theory. The domino theory supposedly predicated that If Vietnam fell, the Chinese would sweep down into all of Asia, the Philippines, Australia, and be landing on the shores of California before we knew it. Come to find out, the domino theory was a fallacy. After the end of the war, the Chinese attempted very shortly to invade Vietnam and were thrown back by the Vietnamese people themselves, who had been fighting the Chinese for over 1,000 years. This lack of understanding of the history of the country of Vietnam is one of the reasons why we got into the trouble that we got into. The other thing was a lot of young American boys, and I say boys because at that time a lot of us were 18 and 19-year-olds just graduating from college, from high school, had not even gone to college yet, were under intense pressure and propaganda from our own government and our own fathers to prove our manhood by fighting for our country. This was something that we all grew up with under the constant auspices of television and the books that we were reading, the stories we were told, and the history we learned in our schools. Americans don't go to war for bad reasons. Americans go to war for justified reasons. This is what we all believed. As time went on and we got to Vietnam, it became apparent that this history was not exactly what we thought it was. I'm going to read from Jack McCloskey, who served as an Army medic between 1962 and 1966. In 1965, he was sent to Santo Domingo. He was recalled from active reserves in July of 1967 for duty in Vietnam. By this time, he had met a woman with strong anti-war connections and had developed serious reservations about the war. Nevertheless, he reported for duty. He says, "I made promises to dead people." What were your first impressions in Vietnam? There was a lot of racial problems in Vietnam, in the rear especially. We'd go into Da Nang and we'd see rebel flags and other things flying. In the field, at least in my company, there was no racial tension whatsoever. I'd say 60% of my company was third world Hispanic or black and Native American. The rest were poor whites. I was in an outfit that saw a lot of combat. From the day I got there to basically the day I left, my first 6 months we operated right outside of Da Nang in a place called Nano Bridge, then Hill 55, and a lot of operations into Happy Valley. These types of places saw lots of combat. What was that experience like, and how did it affect you? I remember the first guy I treated, a 19-year-old Marine who stepped on a bouncing Betty. I remember running up to him and then saying, "Doc, I'm going to live, ain't it?" I said, "Sure, babe," and he died. I remember crying, holding his hand and crying. I cried at the next one. I cried at the next one, and I cried at the next one until I got to the point where I wanted to either jump up and shoot myself or shut down. Inevitably, we get close to people in Vietnam. I got close to people that got killed. This is some of the conflict that a lot of Vietnam veterans deal with today when they come home from the war. Personally, as a medic, I found myself caught between trying to save the lives of the people I was with and not having all of the material and the support that I should have had to do that job. And when I went on R&R in 1971, just before the Tet Offensive, I went and saw my wife in Hawaii. And at that point, I was conflicted about whether I should desert and go back to the world, the United States, and try to duck out and go to Canada, or return. And because I was so close to the men that I was with, I opted to return and finish my tour of duty. And just like Jack McCloskey, I think my hardest time in Vietnam was with the people that I was with. There were 3 of us who used to hang around together. All the 3 of us were medics. This guy Casey from a little town in New Jersey, and this black guy named Alan from Birmingham, Alabama. The 3 of us were tight, and we all had nicknames. I was Plastic Man, Casey was Mike the Mongoose, and Alan was Super Chuck. Both of them got killed. Casey got killed during Allen Brook, and then 2 weeks later, Alan got killed. Both of their deaths hit me hard. It was not death in the sense of death because I saw that all the time. It was when Casey got it, part of me died. And when Alan got it, another part of me died. He feels, in some respects, that he was less close to his wife and closer to the men that he served with in Vietnam. And it was a sense of brotherhood in Vietnam that strung us all together and kept us strong for each other. because eventually we were not fighting for the mission, we were not fighting for the war, we were fighting for each other. So in 1971, a lot of the Vietnam veterans got together as a group and went to Washington, D.C., and outside the White House, they tossed their medals on the White House lawn, rejecting the very awards that they had gotten for bravery and for fighting. They want to let the government know that the medals were not what they were there for. They were there for their own brothers in arms and for the Constitution of the United States. This, I think, was the conflict that we carried home with us, because a lot of us came home and the war continued to go on. I had come home in 1971. I went to work in Seattle, Washington. My wife and I then moved to San Francisco. I went to work in San Francisco, and on April 30th of 1975, I, like a lot of other Vietnam veterans, watched as the helicopters landed on the embassy in Saigon and lifted off the last Americans and Vietnamese that were fleeing what they thought was going to be a terrible retribution on the part of the North Vietnamese. And I can still see the helicopters crashing and sliding into the ocean, being pushed off the decks of the aircraft carriers, a total loss and a total waste of everything that we stood for. To this day, that date is sacred to me and a lot of other Vietnam veterans, the day that Saigon fell. I thought, like a lot of other Vietnam veterans thought, that we would never make these same mistakes again, that we would never make the same errors, that we would never be engaged in a war in someone else's land over reasons that we were not clear on. And then the first Iraq War came, the Gulf War, so to speak, and they thought that the Vietnam syndrome was put to rest. And then came that most despicable of times that most of us now remember, and my children will remember more than I do, was September 11th in 2001. And the nation used that excuse to go to war again. And we started deploying thousands of men and women overseas to Iraq and Afghanistan. What I find to be amazing is that a lot of these veterans that went over to Iraq and Afghanistan, there was no draft, and most of them were enlistees or National Guard. They were volunteers, because at the end of the war, at the end of the Vietnam War, they did away with the draft. And now they have what's known as National Guard or Reserve that come in, and they made multiple deployments of these guys overseas over and over and over again. But what was incredible was to hear that these veterans come back and were saying the same things that we said. And as a matter of fact, in 2008, an organization was formed called the Iraq Veterans Against the War. And a lot of their supporters were Vietnam veterans who were Vietnam Veterans Against the War members. And so we went to work with them. And in 2008, the Iraq Veterans Against the War had their own Winter Soldier hearings in front of Congress. One of these men was Jason Wayne Lemieux, a sergeant in the United States Marine Corps Infantry. He was deployed January of 2003, September 2003, February of 2004, September of 2004, and September of 2005 to March of 2006 at Ramadi in Iraq. 3 deployments, 3 tours overseas. This is what he has to say about his deployment in Iraq. During the invasion of Iraq, during the push north to Baghdad, the rules of engagement given to me were gradually reduced to non-existence. When we first crossed the Kuwait-Iraq border at Azubad in March 2003, we were operating under Geneva Convention guidelines. And with the exception of medical and religious personnel, we were authorized to shoot anyone wearing a military uniform unless they had surrendered. All of that seems pretty clear at this point. In fact, when we were in Vietnam, we all carried the Geneva card around with us. And as a medic, I was required, after I took care of my own people, I was required to offer aid to the enemy. Jason says that by the time we got to Baghdad, however, I was explicitly told by my chain of command that I could shoot anyone who came closer to me than I felt comfortable with. If that person did not immediately move when I ordered them to do so, keeping in mind I don't speak Arabic, my chain of command's general attitude was better them than us, and we were given guidance that reinforced the attitude across the ranks. I watched that attitude intensify throughout my 3 tours. As you could possibly see already, the whole concept was changing about why they were there and who they were fighting. When we were in Vietnam, we couldn't tell who the enemy was. They weren't wearing uniforms. The enemy looked just like the villagers who were all around us at every single time. We had villagers coming in, working inside the wire, inside our base camps. And when we went out into the field, these same villagers were out there. There was no way to tell if they were actually VC, Viet Cong, or North Vietnamese regulars. This was the same thing that was happening in Iraq and Afghanistan. At the start of that second deployment, Jason says, outstanding rules of engagement were that someone had to be displaying hostile intent and committing a hostile act before deadly force could be used. I won't get into the absurdity of asking you to discern what is going on in the mind of another individual, except to say that it was the individual Marine's job to determine the meaning of hostile intent and hostile action. During the April offensive of 2004, in which attacks erupted all over the Anbar province, my unit was involved in a 2-day firefight. Shortly after the firefight was underway, the same commander who had given us the mission ordered that everyone wearing a black dasha and a red headscarf was displaying hostile intent and hostile action and was to be shot. That means that anybody wearing the normal clothing that you would wear in Iraq was considered to be one of the enemy. As I read from these pages and as I think about what happened in Vietnam, I can see so many parallels between the war in Iraq and Afghanistan and the war that we fought in Vietnam, and why today there is so much disillusionment and disgust with what the country has done. In general, the rules of engagement changed frequently and were contradictory. When they were restrictive, they were loosely enforced. Shooting of civilians that were known were not reported because Marines did not want to send their brothers in arms to prison when all they were trying to do was protect themselves in the situation they'd been forced into. With no way to identify their attackers and no clear mission worth dying for, Marines viewed the rules of engagement as either a joke or a technicality to be worked around so that they could bring each other home alive. Not only was the misuses of the rules of engagement in Iraq indicative of supreme strategic incompetence, they are also a moral disgrace. The people who set them should be ashamed of themselves, and they're just one of the many reasons why the troops should be withdrawn from Iraq immediately. Individual veterans made individual choices to stand up for what they believed in, because we swore an oath to protect and defend the United States Constitution. And I think a lot of us still adhere to that oath. That's why I also belong to a group called Veterans for Peace, which was founded in 1985. Veterans for Peace has a statement of purpose. It says, "We, having dutifully served our nation, do hereby affirm our greater responsibility to serve the cause of world peace. To this end, we will work with others towards increasing public awareness of the costs of war, to restrain our government from intervening overtly and covertly in the internal affairs of other nations, to end the arms race, and to reduce and eventually eliminate nuclear weapons, to seek justice for veterans and victims of the war, and to abolish war as an instrument of national policy. To achieve these goals, members of Veterans for Peace pledge to use nonviolent means and to maintain an organization that is both democratic and open, with the understanding that all members are trusted to act in the best interest of the group for the larger purpose of world peace." Today in Hartford, you can see some of the effects of this war that has been going on for all these years. The budget problems in the city of Hartford are directly caused by the costs of the war in supporting the military-industrial complex. Today, in the newspaper, there was an article about huge arms sales Sikorsky is going to be made with Saudi Arabia. And we all know that President Trump today is making his first foreign visits overseas. He went to see the Saudis first, and then he went to Israel, and he's supposed to be going to the Vatican. And what the purpose of all of this is remains to be seen. Donald Trump is the same age that I am, and he probably should have been in Vietnam with the rest of us, or in the military at least during that era. He had deferments, and he had physical disabilities, so he says. But for someone to actively promote the military and war and not having served in it, to me is also a conflict, and one of the reasons why we question what is going on around us in the world. I think the history of the Winter Soldiers is going to be something that we should keep abreast of and we should keep up on. And I'm going to read a little bit more from this book. Radio, what was your duty? Another soldier was asked. Joel Greenberg. Joel Greenberg was a red diaper baby, had considered himself apolitical as a young man. He enlisted in the Marine Corps because he was attracted to the Marines' advertisements promising to make men out of enlistees. He was interviewed with his companion, Annie Liggenball. What was your duty? As a radio teletype, within my platoon we had 3 radio teletype teams, 1 E5, 2 Spec 4s or private first classes. They changed periodically. We provided backup to comm centers. We had the ability to communicate with voice, continuous wave radio, and teletype. When we got in country, it was a month before we could communicate with the people we were supposed to communicate with, because we came over with a new equipment and they still had old equipment. Even though it was all AM radio, we were on the same frequency, but it was like a half a millisecond difference. During the time we were at Phoc Bin, each team had a day on the rig, which meant an 8-hour shift every 3 days. The rest of it was details. It was the 3 police calls a day, filling sandbags, and details, details, and details. Then they took the E5s out of the picture and put us on 12-hour shifts. I didn't see any combat the entire time I was in country. John Lindquist. I turned 180 degrees at that instance. John Lindquist had wanted a military career since he was a young boy. Like many of his peers, he had been captivated by the image of the military in movies and on television. He joined the Marines to be with the baddest branch of the armed forces. He was interviewed with Annie Bailey, his companion for 25 years. I got off of boot camp. The staff sergeant gets on the bus and says, "We have a minute to get off the bus. 5 seconds are over. Now more. Now move." Everybody starts scrambling. He already grabbed the first guy by the hair and threw him out the door. We're all assholes and elbows out the door to go out and stand on the yellow footprints. And the guy next to me started picking his nose. So the sergeant walked up and decked the guy. He knocked him out. I didn't move a muscle. He was waiting for me to move a muscle because he was going to deck me too. I didn't say anything. I didn't do nothing. I didn't move. I already know things are kind of screwed up. It was like a bubble, a membrane in front of my brain. Grunts, mumbling, and an explosion with hands moving apart and upward from a clenched position. I thought, what the hell did I do? I turned 180 degrees at that instant. At that moment, I changed my mind. I say, yes, I'm not going to deal with this. What about the experience had such an impact on you? It was like all those debates in debate class and those raps and arguments from the kids who were already anti-war and against the draft. I'm calling it communist propaganda, and they're true. Everything they said all of a sudden came back at me. I'm not kidding you. I knew that I messed up and it was too late. I'm making $96 a month and I'm going to Vietnam. I knew it wouldn't go any good to resist. I'm stuck. I'm at least man enough to know I got to live up to what I did. These are all of the individuals who went to Vietnam, are all in conflict with what they did. To this day, we're still fighting the war within ourselves. It's probably the only war that still goes on inside us over and over and over. And it probably will be till the day that we leave. I hope to bring you more voices of veterans, and we will again explore the Winter Soldiers. And we will explore in greater detail the Winter Soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan, because it seems to me that these wars are going to continue to go on until we, the American people, have had enough, and we say that we want an end to it. We need to get off of their ground and realize